Hello everyone, and welcome back to History Uncovered. Today, we're sailing back to the 14th century to witness one of the most decisive and brutal naval battles in history, the Battle of Sluys. This wasn't just any skirmish. It was the opening act of the 100 Years' War at sea, a clash of titans that would determine the fate of nations and change the course of European history forever. It's the year 1340. Tensions between England and France are at a boiling point. The English king, Edward III, has audaciously laid claim to the French throne, sparking a conflict that would last for over a century. But to press his claim, Edward needed to do something crucial: get his army across the English Channel and onto French soil. Standing in his way was the formidable French fleet, a massive armada poised to crush any invasion attempt. The French, feeling confident, gathered their ships, along with allies from Genoa and Castile, in the estuary of the Zwin River, right at the port of Sluys in Flanders. This wasn't just a defensive move, it was a blockade. They were effectively trapping the English on their island, strangling their trade with the continent, particularly the vital wool trade with Flanders. The French fleet was a behemoth, numbering around 200 ships, packed with thousands of soldiers and crossbowmen. Their plan was simple: wait for the English, trap them in the narrow inlet, and annihilate them. Back in England, Edward III was in a tight spot. He was facing immense pressure. His coffers were running low, and his political standing was shaky. He knew that a failure to break the French blockade would mean not just the end of his French ambitions, but possibly the end of his reign. Against the advice of some of his counselors who feared the odds, Edward decided to take a colossal gamble. He mustered every ship he could find, from mighty warships to humble fishing boats and merchant cogs, and assembled his own fleet. On June 22, 1340, Edward's fleet set sail from the Orwell estuary. It was smaller than the French force, numbering around 150 to 160 ships, but it had a secret weapon: thousands of England's famed longbowmen. These archers were the medieval equivalent of machine gunners, capable of unleashing a devastating storm of arrows. Edward himself was on board his flagship, the cog Thomas, leading from the front. He was not just a king, he was a commander about to roll the dice on the biggest battle of his life. As the English fleet approached Sluys on the afternoon of June 23rd, they saw the French fleet waiting for them. The French commanders, Hugues Quiéret and Nicolas Béhuchet, had made a critical tactical error. They had chained their ships together in 3 massive lines, stretching across the estuary. Their idea was to create an unbreakable, floating fortress, essentially turning a naval battle into a land battle at sea. They believed this would allow their soldiers to board the English ships and overwhelm them with superior numbers. But Edward III, a shrewd military strategist, saw an opportunity in their mistake. He saw not a fortress, but a trap. The chained-together ships were immobile, clumsy, and unable to maneuver. They were sitting ducks. The wind and tide were also in Edward's favor. He waited patiently for the tide to turn on the morning of June 24th, and then, with the sun at his back, blinding the French defenders, he gave the order to attack. The English fleet advanced in formations of 3, 2 ships filled with longbowmen flanking a 3rd ship carrying men-at-arms for boarding. As they closed the distance, the sky darkened. The English longbowmen unleashed a torrential downpour of arrows. The effect was horrific. The French ships were densely packed with soldiers on their open decks, making them perfect targets. The arrows rained down with terrifying speed and accuracy, decimating the French ranks before they could even get their crossbows into effective range. An English chronicler described the scene as a hailstorm, with arrows flying so thick they blotted out the sun. The French crossbowmen, who took much longer to reload than the longbowmen, were cut down where they stood. The decks of the French ships became slick with blood. Panic began to set in. Once the initial archery barrage had broken the French formation and morale, the English ships crashed into the French lines. The battle descended into a brutal ship-to-ship melee. English knights and men-at-arms swarmed aboard the French vessels. It was chaos, the clash of steel, the splintering of wood, and the desperate cries of men. The French, despite their initial numerical advantage, were now trapped. Their chained ships prevented any retreat or tactical repositioning. Ships that were captured by the English couldn't be moved out of the way, further clogging the battle line. The fighting raged for hours, a savage, close-quarters slugfest. The French admiral, Hugues Quiéret, was killed early in the battle while defending his ship. The other commander, Nicolas Béhuchet, a former treasurer with little naval experience, was captured. In a fit of vengeful fury for his role in raiding English coastal towns, he was summarily hanged from the yardarm of his own ship. It was a brutal end, reflecting the savage nature of the conflict. As the day wore on, the French lines completely collapsed. Some French and Genoese sailors, seeing the hopelessness of their situation, tried to escape by jumping overboard, only to drown in their heavy armor. Only the Genoese contingent, commanded by the experienced mercenary Barbavera, managed to cut their ships free and fight their way out of the estuary, escaping the carnage. By nightfall, the battle was over. The result was a catastrophe for the French. It was one of the most one-sided victories in naval history. Of the massive French fleet, nearly every ship was either captured or sunk. The human cost was staggering. Estimates suggest that France and its allies may have lost as many as 25,000 men. The English losses, while still significant at around 4,000, were comparatively light. The Zwin estuary was said to be so filled with bodies that one could walk across it without getting their feet wet. The French court was so terrified of King Philip VI's reaction that, according to legend, it was his court jester who finally broke the news by joking that the English sailors don't even have the guts to jump into the water like our brave French. For Edward III, it was a triumph of monumental proportions. He had not only survived, but had utterly annihilated his enemy. In a letter to his son, the Black Prince, which stands as the earliest known English naval dispatch, Edward proudly proclaimed himself the sovereign of the narrow seas. The victory was complete. The consequences of the Battle of Sluys were immediate and far-reaching. The destruction of the French fleet gave England undisputed control of the English Channel for an entire generation. This naval supremacy was the key that unlocked France. Without the threat of a French fleet intercepting them, the English could now land armies on the continent at will. This directly led to the famous English land campaigns and victories that would define the Hundred Years' War. Battles like Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356, where English longbowmen again proved decisive, would likely never have happened without the victory at Sluys. It allowed Edward III to transport his armies, keep them supplied, and project his power deep into French territory. In the immediate aftermath, Edward landed his army and laid siege to the city of Tournai. While that particular siege was unsuccessful, the strategic picture had been fundamentally altered. The Battle of Sluys ensured that the war would be fought on French soil, not English. It demonstrated the lethal effectiveness of the English longbow and the brilliance of Edward III as a commander. So, when we think of the Hundred Years' War, we often picture knights in shining armor and fields of archers. But we must remember that it all began on the water, in a blood-soaked estuary at Sluys. It was a battle born of a king's gamble, won by tactical genius and the devastating power of the longbow, and it set the stage for a century of conflict that would forge the identities of both England and France.